of the Electric Power Authority of Puerto Rico. This hearing is being held virtually as a cautionary measure in order to reduce the spreading of COVID-19. We welcome our LUMA representatives and from the Electric Power Authority, as well as the Independent Consumer Protection Office. Also, to the persons that are tuning in through our YouTube channel. During the morning today, we are accompanied by the Chairman of the Energy Bureau, Edison Aviles de Lis, and Associate Commissioners Ángel Rivera de la Cruz. Good morning. Lilian Mateo Santos. Good morning. Ferdinand Ramos Sogard. Good morning. And Sylvia Ugarte Araujo. Good morning. On March 15th of 2022, LUMA presented before the Energy Bureau a written document entitled Motion Submitting Quarterly Reconciliations and FCA, PPCA, and FOS Calculated Factors and request for confidential treatment. Through this motion, LUMA presented a proposal of reconciliation of the clauses of FECA, PPCA, and FOS corresponding to the months of January, February, and March of 2022. Besides, LUMA presented proposed factors for said clauses to be pending for the period of April 1st to June 30th of 2022. On March 16th of 2022, the Energy Bureau granted a resolution and order ordering LUMA and the Electric Power Authority to present certain pertinent information in this procedure. This order commanded that LUMA and the Electric Power Authority appear before the technical hearing to discuss the documents presented. Besides, the resolution requested that the public presented on before March 28th of 2022 their comments and suggestions in writing to the Energy Bureau. These comments can be sent to comments@jrsp.pr.gov to the attention of the chairman, indicating the number of this procedure. On March 18th of 2022, LUMA and the Electric Power Authority presented before the Energy Bureau its reply to the requests of additional information according to the order of March 16th of 2022. We clear up that both LUMA and the Electric Power Authority have presented public versions of all documents of analysis and support to their requests. The public documents can be found available for public scrutiny in the case file on the webpage of the Energy Bureau. This technical hearing will be held in Spanish and will be recorded in audio and video. In the case that part of the LUMA's personnel or of the authority need to express themselves in English, they will be allowed to do so. To this end, the Energy Bureau is transmitting this technical conference live through its YouTube channel, along with a translation of it in English and Spanish for the benefit of the general public. A copy of the recording of the technical hearing will be made a part of the administrative file of this case. Now, we will establish the instructions to follow during the technical conference, and then I'll take the oath of LUMA's personnel and of the Electric Power Authority, whom will appear before the Energy Bureau. Before answering any questions or addressing the Bureau, all participants should identify themselves for the record, indicating their name and position in LUMA or in the Electric Power Authority. Please keep your microphones in silent mode while you are not addressing the Energy Bureau in order to avoid any disturbances caused by background noise. Based on the information provided by LUMA's legal representation, the following persons have appeared today for testimony. When you hear your name, please say present or here. Basada en los representantes legales de LUMA, las siguientes personas se encuentran en la conferencia técnica de hoy para el testimonio. Por favor, cuando escuchen su nombre, digan presente o aquí. Mario Hurtado, oficial regulatorio ejecutivo, present. Ashley Englund, Vice President Regulatory, present. Melanie Jefferson, Director of Billing Services, present. Ryan Walsh, Director of SSCA, present. Jocelyn Estrada, Manager of Tariffs and Budgets, present. Jose Gandia. Supervisor of Regulatory Reporting, present. Wanda Esteves, Lead PPOA Commercial Administrator, present. Attorney Margarita Mercado, could you confirm that the persons that we've just mentioned are the ones that will be providing testimony during today's technical conference? Good morning. Yes, confirmed. Thank you. Now, based on the information provided by the Electric Power Authority's legal representation, the following persons will appear in today's conference to provide testimony. When you hear your name, please say present or here. Engineer Josue Colon. Present. Thank you. Engineer Mara Carmen Sapa. Present. Thank you. Engineer Jorge Coto. Present. Miss Elenia Castro. Present. Engineer Edwin Barbosa. Present. Mr. Nelson Morales. Present. Attorney Bolaños, could you confirm that the persons that I've just mentioned are the ones that will be providing testimony today? Good morning, everyone. Respectfully, Katiuska Bolaños in representation of the Electric Power Authority, and yes, these are the persons that will be representing the Electric Power Authority today. Thank you. I'll be taking the oath. Do you confirm that the testimony that you will be providing today is true, accurate, and based on your own personal knowledge, and that, to the best of your understanding, none of the information that you will be providing today is deceitful or untrue? ¿Confirma usted que el testimonio que estará brindando hoy es cierto, correcto y basado en su propio conocimiento personal y que, según lo mejor de su entendimiento, nada de la información que usted brindará hoy es engañosa o incierta? Mario Hurtado. Yes, I confirm. Ashley Emblem. Sí lo confirmo. Melanie Jefferson. Sí lo confirmo. Brian Walsh. Sí lo confirmo. Jocelyn Estrada. Yes, I confirm. Jose Gandia. Yes, I confirm. Wanda Esteves. Yes, I confirm. Engineer Josue Colon. Yes, I confirm. Engineer Mary Carmen Zapata. Yes, I confirm. Engineer Jorge Coto. Yes, I confirm. Miss Elenia Castro. Yes, I confirm. Engineer Edwin Barbosa. Yes, I confirm. Mr. Nelson Morales. Yes, I confirm. Thank you very much to everyone. Let the record reflect that all persons that will be providing testimony answered in the affirmative. Now I'd like to ask the chairman of the Energy Bureau whether he has any initial comments that he'd like to address to our public. Now I'd ask the associate commissioners, do they have any initial comments that they'd like to address? No, not at this time. Not on my part either. Not on my part. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the Electric Power Authority, do they have any initial comments that they would like to present at this time? Not on our end, no. All right, thank you. I'd like to ask LUMA whether they have any initial comments that they'd like to present at this time. A very good morning, Attorney Margarita Mercado Echegaray in representation of LUMA. Mr. Mario Hurtado will address the Bureau briefly. Thank you, Mr. Hurtado. Good morning, Mario Hurtado for the record, representing LUMA. Thank you, Attorney. And a very good day to our chairman and commissioners of the Bureau and consultants. We're here because we are at a challenging time. We are seeing prices in crude internationally that have been ascending for 24 months now, imposed by the recovery of the economy. Also, the negative impacts of the pandemic, along with issues with international supply and a delay in the volumes of productive related as opposed to demand internationally. Recently, the rises in petroleum are at levels of increase unforeseen since 2008, compounded by the issue of Ukraine and Russia. It's important to highlight and is of the knowledge of this bureau that the responsibility of LUMA is to calculate the consumption of fuel and energy. The costs are provided by the Electric Power Authority, who has the responsibility of generating energy and acquire fuel for the generation of energy at the authority's power facilities. The Energy Bureau, as independent regulator, assesses, certifies any final adjustment in rates for customers in the cost of fuel and purchase. According to the legal framework and regulatory framework of Puerto Rico, LUMA neither controls how the increase in fuel costs impacts rates directly for customers' bills, nor do they financially benefit from any change or increase in the costs of the electric power rates. The fuel riders currently and energy purchase represent more than 70% of the final rate for consumers. All of the operational and maintenance costs in the electrical network come from the income produced by the base rate. That's another component of the rate, and this has not changed since 2019. LUMA has not requested an increase in the base rate, which represents approximately 20% of the total costs to consumers. Although LUMA does not control cost of fuel, we are very aware of the economic impact that these costs of fuel are having for generation for our customers, and we are determined to do everything within our reach to help affected customers with the impact and increase of the rate for these costs of fuel. And we are determined to help our customers who might be facing financial difficulties with a payment plan from LUMA, or reporting to them regarding the financial aid and government aid that are available to them. Customers can calling 1-844-888-LUMA 5862, visiting the website lumapr.com, or they can approach one of the customer service centers. LUMA has already impacted more than 9,200 payment agreements and supported more than 1 million subsidies for families, taking up approximately $27.5 million in assistance coming from the Low-Income Energy Assistance Program and the COVID Rental Assistance Program, among others. We continue to be determined in communicating these options to our customers and give them guidance. We have done press events and posted on social networks, and also provided information accompanying the customers' invoices or bills. We have done deliveries by mail with more than 2.2 million informative brochures with this information available for our customers. And LUMA is working with mayors of municipalities of Puerto Rico so that they can divulge these opportunities to their communities as well. LUMA continues to work and put efforts to try to help customers who might require greater installments or additional financial aid to make their payments to the Electric Power Authority. LUMA also continues to actively support incentives of the Energy Bureau to accelerate the use of renewable energies and reduce the dependence in imported fuel for the generation of electricity. Part of the solution to the high costs of fuel is to use less fuel through a greater use of renewable energies. Ever since LUMA began its operation in the network, we've added more than 16,000 customers to net metering to allow them to use distributed energy produced by themselves, mostly with solar panels. And this has added additional capacity of 90 megawatts of renewable energy to the system. At LUMA, we also work currently for the interconnection of more than 170 megawatts of large-scale projects with approved contracts by the Bureau. Contracts approved by the Bureau already, and we are working on studies for interconnection of more than 800 megawatts of the first tranche of proposed solutions approved by the Energy Bureau, we are taking necessary steps to allow the next tranches of these proposals to be processed in order to add more large-scale energy to Puerto Rico and to have these be successful in the increase of renewable energies at competitive prices and with greater accountability for customers. These are part of the essential steps for the transformation of the electrical sector of Puerto Rico, as has already been chosen. Currently, it is important for the system to be operated in an efficient manner and taking into account the impact of the cost of fuel. At this time, the costs of liquid fuels numbers, apologies, list number 2 and 6, as they are known, per unit of BTU are at approximately twice the price or value of energy unit of natural gas. And we see a difference then in cost of maintenance and environmental costs as well as we use natural gas. LUMA, as system operator, works to coordinate operation of the system with the authority and with other generators in order to do economic dispatch, being mindful of the technical parameters and physical limitations of the grid. LUMA does this following the operational principles of the system as approved by this Bureau and the corresponding procedures for the clear and orderly operation of the system. The objective of the more than 3,000 employees of LUMA is one that we share with current stakeholders of the system, which is to create a better future for Puerto Rico with cleaner energy sources at competitive prices and with greater reliability and resilience. That's my initial declaration. Thank you. Thank you very much to Mr. Hurtado. I would ask the Electric Power Authority, do they have any presentation? Good morning, Katiuska Bolaños, in representation of the Electric Power Authority. No presentations. Does LUMA have any presentations? Good morning, Margarita Mercado Chegaray, for the record, in representation of LUMA. There is no initial representation. Thank you. With there being no presentations, we then move on so that we can begin with questions from commissioners in full towards LUMA or the authority. Yes, thank you, Antonio. If the other commissioners would allow, I have some doubts regarding the motion of compliance of March 16th of 2022 by the Electric Power Authority. I know that I just heard the legal representation of Attorney Bolaños. Maybe she could clear up these doubts as companions get into technical aspects during the morning today. One point of the document submitted by the authority's legal representation, well, from what I understand, they were not able to provide information related to what we call in the resolution order of the Bureau, reserve account. From what I read of the writings, the authority's legal representation and not having a reserve account. But Attorney Bolaños specifically and the buffet to which she belongs has been in this process since before LUMA even came into the administration of the electric grid. And there were many discussions in these processes of deferrals and federal funds. And as part of these processes, we always spoke of the reserve account, which basically tells what they had in their coffers because the Bureau for the public interest and in hearings and in the decision making that had been delegated by the legislator into this entity. Well, it becomes necessary for wise decision making to be mindful of what the charge flow is for the authority, and that's what we referred. They were not able to provide information. However, they did mention that they did have the necessary personnel to clear up how much they have in their coffers if that was a point. And so, attorney, if you'd be so kind, this is one of the two questions that I have. If you'd be so kind, and if you have personnel from the authority that might be able to tell us to date, what funds do you have in COFRs as the Electric Power Authority? Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Respectfully, Attorney Bolaños, this is true. I understand the discussions that we had. Maybe it's a conceptual program of how the account is called or termed, but any questions regarding the authority's liquidity is in the Directorate of Financing that it's present, and we'll be able to answer any questions. I don't know if you would want us to yield to them so that you can address the questions to them, or if you want to have this later. That's personally yours truly. What I'm interested in knowing as a point of this hearing is, to date, what's the money that the authority has in their coffers or in pocket? Yes, for this, Mr. President, Mr. Nelson will address you. Yes, good morning, everyone. Nelson for the record. As of March 11th of 2022, the Electric Power Authority has a cash inbox of $1,092.1 million. This comes out of $770.6 billion belonging to the service accounts of transmission and distribution, according to the contract of operations and maintenance with LUMA. Also, there's an amount of $331.5 million that represents the operational accounts of the authority. Thank you. Excellent reply. And basically this compares with previous processes where out of those reserves that were created with LUMA's entry, will the accounts of the authority have it between 300 to 400 million for what you called operational funds? And that's the answer that I wanted to hear, in line with what we had in mind of previous processes. Very kind of you with your reply. The second question that I had for Attorney Bolaños, in your writing, in your document, you make arguments regarding a deferral that was made in a resolution in order from the part of the authority as a result of some expressions made by the authority with the implementation or application of a clause of some contracts that you have with the gas supplier, where when there's no gas, these clauses come into effect, and one could expect some funds in the case that of the other fuel, which is in this case is petroleum. So the Bureau has deferred close to 14 million in previous processes, expecting or waiting for the authority to enter processes or discussions with these suppliers. And then depending on the results, the Bureau would then be able to make a determination, or should make a determination, where if the funds are recovered, it's not passed on to the consumer, or if it's not recovered, well, then eventually it would allow the authority to recover it from consumers. So we're talking about close to 14 million. However, in your writings, you have emphasized that you'd like for it to be that in this process during this quarter and this process that we're doing, besides the request of close to 4.2 cents per kilowatt hour, that they also be allowed to recover those 14 million from part of the authority. It'd be an additional increase, even though eventually there is a possibility of it there being an income that it be returned to the consumer. That's my understanding of what was laid out in what is writing. I want to make sure that this is the authority's petition. Attorney, good morning. Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, Engineer Jose Colon, if you would allow, it's just that to the question of the Chairman of the Bureau, we at the Electric Power Authority should clear up the following. The motion that was filed as you very well mentioned, what we are seeking to clear up is that every time that the Bureau, in the exercise of their discretion, when they've granted a discount based on possible negotiations or claims that the authority has not received, what has happened in practice is that our cash flow has been affected. It has created financial setbacks for us on the financing sector. That's in the meeting. It could explain it in more detail. And what we would like to leave as an important point for the attention of the commissioners and the Bureau is that the Electric Power Authority, without a doubt, will return all of the money to the customers that we receive from our claims, be it reimbursements to federal entities or any of our insurances, once we have the income in our accounts. But to get ahead, if you will, when we do not yet have final agreements of what we're going to receive from the claims that we're carrying out, well, the direct consequences of this type of action is that the authority does not recover its operational expenses, and this results in an cash flow issue, and it can expose the authority by putting us in a extremely difficult financial situation because we don't have our resources, our income from the only place that they come from is from the billing of electricity that we do produce. So if on top of that we do not receive the income, which is directly related to that electricity that we are producing, the consequences are then a financial challenge. And that's what we wanted to clear up. It's the reality that we wanted to present to the Bureau from the authority's point of view. And therein lies the resolution, or what we filed regarding that particular. As I said, there's the financing director is here and the director of finances of the authority, Nelson Morales and Elenia Castro. They could also expand on that particularly, and also why the authority needs. And we're obviously more than willing to explain whatever needs to be explained, but no, it's not that the Bureau grant some discounts that the authority doesn't have resources to do, because it puts us in a very critical situation, specifically with the acquisition of fuel. Thank you, Director, for clearing that up. We are fully aware of that. Yes. It's just, if you allow me to finish, Attorney, thank you, Director, for clearing that up. And by understand this is a prerogative of the Bureau, looking at the interests of the public and the authority's finances, but also that the bill be justified and reasonable whenever the customer has to pay for it. That's why when we do these processes, we do these determinations where, in fact, in the past, we have done deferments by over $100 million. In this case, you're mentioning $14 million. First, that's the first point. Second, this is a reason why it's so important to know from the Bureau how much money the authority has in coffers. The number that Morales answered a few minutes ago was of over $300 million. These are all elements that the Energy Bureau, the commissioners, and their advisors take into account when establishing how we can best safeguard the public interests in making decisions with the authority that legislation has given us. Clearing up, having this cleared by yours truly, I do need for you to confirm from the part of the authority whether what is being requested in this motion is that besides the 4.2 cents that was requested by LUMA in representation of the Electric Power Authority as a reconciliation of the cost of fuel and energy, do they want to include at this time the 14 million that were deferred in previous quarters? So that's the answer that I'm looking for. Good morning to all honorable commissioners. Maria Carmen Zapata, Electric Power Authority. In the estimates or calculations of the costs of fuel that we've submitted to this Bureau and to LUMA for the adjustment of this last quarter between December 2021 to February 2022. In that amount of money that was calculated for billing, it the $14 million are not there. So the question again is, besides the 4 cents that are being requested by LUMA on behalf of the authority for this quarter as an increase to recover expenses incurred in the purchase of energy and fuel, whether you're asking to add the 14 million that were from previous periods to clear up, the response is no, because the 14 million that you've mentioned are not included in the calculations of the billing that we filed for this quarter of December to February. Therefore, we are not presenting it because it's not being requested for billing. So the 4 cents cover everything that we have filed. All right, well then allow me to, maybe the attorney would be the one to clear this up. What I'm understanding here, and I'll quote from what was written by the authority's legal representation. It says, this is the reason why the authority understands that the Bureau should not continue to defer additional costs for fuel that the authority has already paid for and used. In page, let me find the number, 1, 2, 3, page 4. It also says, it is contrary to the mechanism that the Energy Bureau established rate order, which is important to, oh, there's the interpreter. That has been read way too fast. Then it goes on. There's the interpreter. Apologies, it's being read way too fast. Would you like to clear up now? Of course, go ahead. That's what I want to hear. From the motion, what stems from it is the following. The authority, nowhere in the motion, is requesting billing the customer for the 14 million. That amount from June to November is already deferred. The only reason why mention is made in the motion is to make a narrative of amounts that have already been deferred. What the authority expressed in the motion is to please not consider any additional holdings. In other words, any amount from December, January, and February, which is the matter for this hearing, December, January, and February, that it not be deferred because these are expenses where the authority has already incurred them and it needs to be recovered in order to maintain liquidity. Very good. So it's clear then that you are not requesting to add 4.2 cents to the recovery of that deferred amount of 14 million in this process, which means that the authority will continue in the process that I believe was already initiated to try to recover those funds. If it's recovered, it never goes to the customer. If it's not recovered, then you'll need to report what amount of the 14 million were not recovered to then, in the future, put our famous riders to allow the authority the opportunity to recover the incurred costs as it's part of the process that is done here in the reconciliations. Having cleared that, I feel very satisfied with the response from the authority. So, colleagues, in addition to this, to begin at least, I have no further questions. Mr. Chairman, if you would allow, and something that was mentioned earlier in the beginning of your address will be cleared up. The fact that the authority has requested that the 30 million not be deferred, which would be an additional cost of diesel for December, January, and February, it doesn't imply in any way that there will be an increase above the 4 cents, because that cost of fuel, since the cause disposes it as such, is already included in the reconciliation and in the projection of the factors for this coming quarter. Therefore, what the authority requests is not above the 4 cents. Of course, this would lead us what the authority is seeking to please Bureau. Well, not please Bureau. Do not do what you did in the previous quarter. And regarding these 30 million, leave them as part of the petition. And that's something that we're going to look at during this afternoon to see if it's possible. And we are always going to be aware that public interest is defending allowing the authority to recover incurred expenses, but at the same time, that the consumer pay a reasonable and just bill in a determined amount of time. We are aware of clearing this up, and I thank everyone for answering the questions of yours truly. They will undisputably help us to make determinations today. Always in favor of public interest. Called on by Electric Power Authority. Mr. President, correct. What you've just laid out is what we'd like to present and what we have sought through what we filed in the past week. And it's just to note or respectfully alert the Bureau that with the conditions that the authority are in now financially and with the challenges that we're facing right now with the increase of inadvertently that have been caused by the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where prices have shot up of orders to unexpected costs, that the Bureau take this into consideration because the cash flow of the Electric Power Authority is being affected, and we are not in a position to defer any operational expense that we are incurring as a result of the energy that we are producing for the people of Puerto Rico. Thank you, Director, for clearing that up. Mr. Chairman, if you would allow, this is Commissioner Mateo Santos for the record. Having heard the legal representation of the authority and the executive director of the authority, and having seen the documents that they have filed, it's not clear to me, first, the sense of urgency or the status of the discussions that are being done by the authority to recover from the supplier of these funds from the supplier of fuel, which should be in the authority's pocket. It should not be passed on to the consumer, since that's what the clause of the contract is there for. Not only in the previous that we deferred for the benefit of the consumer, but also with any departure that corresponds to the period that we are examining. Neither is it clear to me the order of magnitude of the issues with flow, since they have not been presented in the motion, not even in a confidential manner. And here, a while ago, that we've only been given 2 points that don't really serve for the public. The public who is listening and hearing, they don't have a point of reference to understand what the cash flow situation is for the authority. So I'd like to hear from the Electric Power Authority's representation additional information to allow us to put this data into context and understand why we couldn't transfer those savings to the consumer or eliminate that impact to the consumer if it can be recovered from the supplier because they haven't complied with their contract. And what is the level of risk of making a decision such as this, which at other times, to be worthy of note, we have taken at the behest of the authority itself, even in circumstances where the Bureau had to say no because it was risky, and the Bureau at that time said no. This was when we were working with the situation of the earthquakes. So I believe that there's a need for more information, at least to me. I need more information, and the public deserves greater information in order to put this request into context. Thank you. Yes, again, Engineer Jose Colon with the Electric Power Authority. Happily, Ms. Commissioner Mateo, the Electric Power Authority will provide all the information that is required of us. We, as always, have espoused that we have no purpose to declare confidentiality in any of these processes that we're carrying out. We have the representatives of the financial side of the authority available to answer any questions. And then regarding the doubt that you presented regarding the claims that we're bringing with the companies that supply fuel, specifically of natural gas in the area of South Latui and in the north, the company New Fortress Energy, these are being handled with a sense of urgency. We have a team, a legal team, and of engineers working on it. It's a $1 million worth transaction in the millions. It will obviously not be resolved en route, so to speak. We are working with this. We have been working with this since the end of last year. The Office of Fuel is directing this efforts with our legal team. And day to day, we are working with the matter. That's the reason why our petition to the Bureau is that until we don't have a conclusion that is final regarding these two claims that we're bringing forth and how much we are expecting to recover from both contracts, well, that there be no speculation to the future in that direction, because these are considerable amounts that are under discussion. And obviously opportunity, as soon as we have the information, the first thing that we're going to do is to share it with the Bureau in order for the Bureau to make the determination that they believe is prudent and reasonable, which from our point of view will be to return 100% of what we claim to all the customers of the Electric Power Authority of Puerto Rico. Thank you, Mr. Executive Director. I think that in alignment with what you just expressed, we need, before making a decision for this quarter, we need to have all the information that has not yet been seen from the reports that have been presented in previous weeks regarding this matter. The authority has been excessively concise and vague in the information provided to the Bureau, in spite of the fact that we have, I cannot presume otherwise, and it'd be very dangerous to presume or assume anything, but we do need to presume that the authority has estimates and has some analysis of how much it's expecting to recover and greater amount of detail of what above what it's given the Bureau. So in alignment with this position that you've just espoused, that you will give us the information in order to allow us to make a decision that is of the highest benefit, well, we need details. We can't continue to receive general comments in the authority's filings. So I would dearly appreciate that you file all this information that you must have as soon as possible, because if you're analyzing this information for a claim, you need to have more information than what you've given us. Of course, Jose Colon again with the Electric Power Authority. Ms. Commissioner Mateo, you will receive from the Electric Power Authority, without a doubt, all of the information related to both claims once the Electric Power Authority feels comfortable that the information is accurate, and that when we have the information at its moment, that it be accurate and that it can be shared with the Bureau, and that it will not lead to the Bureau erring. Our purpose is to have more accurate information. That way the Bureau, in their responsibilities, might be able to have correct information that avoids the Bureau making determinations that affect not just the Electric Power Authority, but also in the future our customers. Because as the chairman of the Bureau has very well said, if at any moment any charge is deferred, which might not have been recovered, well, then the customers of the Electric Power Authority in the future might be able to see an additional reconciliation to recover those costs. And what we want is that what we are hoping to recover be correct, as accurate as possible within the variables at stake, in such a way that the Bureau, with its discretion and in the exercising of their role, might make correct and precise decisions. That's the way we always see this. Thank you. Director, thank you for the commitment of providing the information. We hope to receive it before we make a determination. But I would like to frame by your legal representation and all the colleagues working by the authority to specify why in a historical context, and I think it's been discussed, but I'd just like to sum up. With that flow of charge, or with a similar one, the Energy Bureau got to defer up to $200 million, and nobody at the authority said that the operations were in jeopardy. This was in the past. If this has changed, then it needs to be expressed to us, that you quote us, that you reference documentation. Otherwise, we already have a history that we are going to use when making a determination. It would seem to me, by your expressions, that the big difference, if you will, regarding this claim and the claims for federal funds was the certainty of recovering. Having said that, it is necessary also for you to explain to us what your analysis is for risk in order for us to make a determination. So I'm counting on your commitment that you have just espoused at this time, and we hope that the information we might have at the Energy Bureau to make a determination, with a caveat that if the information is not submitted, the Bureau will exercise their discretion to make a determination using, among other things, the information in the administrative file in this process and the history that of our executions in the past. Thank you, Director. We concur with what you've just said, Mr. Chairman. We, as I said, once we have the information that is accurate and correct, we'll share with the Bureau so that the Bureau, as you very well said, might be able to exercise their due discretion. And as the law provides, they might make the determination that they believe is for good. And what we are hoping is that the customer might not be adversely affected with any of the determinations that are made. That's why it's important for the information that the authority provides to be accurate and correct. Mr. President, if you will allow, what's happening is that, you apologize if I may intervene, but the Commissioner Mateo expressed regarding details of the liquidity of the authority. And here's Mr. Nelson Morales. He's available to answer any question that she or the Bureau might have regarding that. In fact, I would like, again, for Nelson to give an explanation, even if it's brief. Nelson? So that the Bureau can have the information. Thank you. Before you continue, Nelson, apologies. We have, I think if I'm not mistaken, already asked for their review presentation. They said no. So we'd go into the process of our questions. That's why I would ask the first question now as a part of the process. We have a type of order, if you will. After I conclude my questioning, it's up to Commissioner Rivera. I don't know if Commissioner Rivera or the others believe that a presentation ought to be done, or if you'd like to ask the questions and then wait throughout, so that eventually through your questioning, the information might be provided. Or would you leave it for after? I leave it to you, Commissioner Rivera. You're next in line. So I leave that to you. For my part, Mr. Chairman, I think, excuse me, Engineer. For my part, Mr. Chairman, I think that it'd be more convenient to go into the discussion of the questions. My first line of questioning is along this line, and I think that we can begin the conversation with Mr. Morales and Ms. Castro from the part of the authority, or any member of LUMA that might have additional information. And if there's anything left, then Mr. Morales might believe that it's to be discussed. He can then bring it into the discussion. That's my recommendation. Well, then go ahead, Commissioner Rivera. Josue Colon with Electric Power, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner. I believe that from what you've just mentioned, Answering your questions might be answering the question that Distinguished Commissioner Mateo presented just a moment ago. Among other things, engineer, as the chairman has very well said, there's also a lot of information that the Bureau would need from the part of the authority. And I'll tell you the reasons why. The Bureau makes its determinations based on the information that it has on the record. It can't be information, it can't be something general. It can't be basically a flow of information that is incomplete. It has to be something concrete, tangible, something that can be measured to allow the Bureau to make a determination. For example, when the authority says that they have a cash flow issue, well then, beyond just saying this would create a cash flow issue, it needs to be shown with data. That's the information that I believe I would discuss with Mr. Morales and Ms. Castro. And if any additional information is needed, as we've done in past hearings, we would give the authority a set amount of time to present their information, and then the Bureau will be able to make a determination before the end of the month. That's basically the way that we could work it. And as I said, this has always been a conversation between the Bureau and those regulated, both the Electric Power Authority as well as LUMA. So within that consensus, I think that it'd be more beneficial if we do a conversation in this way. We concur with what you've just mentioned, and the Electric Power Authority will always be willing to provide information that is accurate and correct for both our operations, to develop them according to the law and our obligations, and also to allow the Bureau to do its responsibility correctly without prejudice for the customers of Electric Power Puerto Rico. So Nelson, go ahead. Thank you, engineer. Well, now be Commissioner Rivera with his questions. Mr. Morales, good morning. First, I'll do a series of questions starting with the financial condition of the authority, but as I always do in my introductions, the questions are to both the Electric Power Authority and LUMA, and to whatever personnel might have the information can provide it, always identifying themselves for the record. Mr. Morales, good morning. First of all, welcome. It's a pleasure to hear you again. At the outset, you stated that there were 1,092, well, rounding off the numbers. It's Monday, I've only just had tea, so I'm going to round off these numbers, but $1,092 million is, or a billion, 0.9 billion is in the LUMA's, in both operational accounts. 0.6, that's into transmission and distribution, 331.5 million, which you've identified as the operational account of the authority. Before going into the operational, could you describe the reason why these accounts are separate and what each of them is used for? Yes, good morning to everyone. As far as the separation of the accounts, specifically those denominated as T&D servants accounts, it's according to the Operations and Management Agreement between LUMA, the authority, and P3. They are several service accounts that require additional reserves and deposits, depending on whether it's federal funds or capital improvements and other amounts of federal funds. It is requested then with an X amount of reserve to make sure that these disbursements can be covered in a way that does not affect services rendered. In like manner, there are several accounts related to the disbursements of purchase of fuel that require reserves, or for several months also to make sure that there's funds available immediately in order to cover these bills. I wanted to mention that there are several service accounts according to the Operations Management Agreement. I wanted to mention that at the beginning of the conference, I had been asked about the balance the balance of the authority's coffers. We had mentioned a billion, 1 billion.92. This is at March 11th of 2022 compared to December 17th of 2021. At the time, the amount in coffers was of 178.6 billion. So we see a reduction then of close to 100 million, to be accurate, of 90 from 95.7. And this is due to the fact that the allotments for purchase of fuel and the sudden rise that we have seen in the past months. And there's the indifference to recover that amount. Now, acknowledging the way that the markets are looking and these reductions, well, we've responsibly determined that all the amounts of expenses that we incur in fuel might be recovered as soon as possible. We understand the authority's position, and that is what we are going to be discussing, and we are going to talk a little bit regarding that cash flow. You said 1.987 billion at September. Do you have the division between the T&D account and the authority's account for December? Of course. What would the split be there? Yes, on December 17th, the T&D servants accounts had a balance of $714 million, and the other operational accounts of the authority, 472.7 billion. So, thank you. So, understand that effect of time. The operational account of the authority and the operational account of the transmission distribution center, and remembering the analysis that had been done for the OMA contract from 2 years ago or so. Part of that in those accounts, if you will, where since these accounts where during the month there's billable and payable, correct, of course. Daily, the authority and LUMA and the authority, they receive funds, they are distributed in the accounts, and those accounts funds are drawn from it. So that amount that is thought to have there is just to make sure that there is money available to pay suppliers in given months, so that that supply might not be interrupted, among other things, correct? Correct. According to the Operations and Management Agreement. Exactly. So then, according to the nature of these accounts, the balance in these accounts will vary depending on, first off, on where in the month we're at, what month we're referring to. So there's that variation, right? That variability in the balances of these accounts. It's normal in the long term. Correct. There are many variables. Correct. Yeah, so what I mean is it's very difficult to compare 2 points in time with these accounts based specifically on the operational expenses that are also variable within the month and month to month. So in that sense, what is maybe tried to have is enough balance to not run the risk of being left without funds at a particular month. Correct? That's correct. All right, good. You spoke of the purchase of fuel. According to what comes out of the last rate revision, the authority at that time had mentioned or had established that the authority doesn't have its accounting with the use of what is known as a system of accounts by FERC, correct? Yes, that's correct. It was in representation. All right, then. So there's different accounts from where they come from. When you talk about operational accounts of the authority of $331.5 million, what's paid out of there? Or if it's just one account, are they multiple? How does it work? How does that flow work for the authority? There are several accounts there, including the payroll, including payment to contractors, payments to suppliers, among others. All right, so these are different accounts for different functions within the authority. Correct. And each of these accounts has their own, I don't want to say reserve margin, but let's call it a reserve margin, just for lack of a better term. In one of these accounts, the authority understands that it should have a specific margin of reserve, or does the authority simply take the 331.4 with a global margin of reserve of the authority? That we keep that always in looking after the balance. It is through a projection of cash flow, and I like to highlight that that information is public information. It is published weekly, and we have seen, owing to the reduction of from December to March, that's where it draws our attention with the authorities, to make sure that we have working capital in order to cover all the operational costs. That's why we maintain, or we espouse our position regarding this. No, sir, I understand the authority's position. You don't need to reiterate throughout the entire conversation. What I'm trying to understand is, where is the emergency? Where is the concern from the part of the authority? Let's go a year back. During the past year, what has the lowest point been of that operational reserve of the authority? Whereby March 11, which that amount in the past year, if you have the information on hand. I do not have that information in hand, but it's the trajectory that has been had by the balance of the cash is what we've expressed our concern on. Could you provide before Friday the lowest and highest point of each of these operational accounts? Maybe the cash flow of the authority and that of service of transmission and distribution? Of course, yes. All right, good, thank you. So then, just a moment ago, you spoke of the account of fuel purchase. I think that it was a term that you used. Could you explain how this works? Is it separate, what you call the operational account of the Electric Power Authority? Yes, there's an account for the purchase of fuel known as a bunker C. And also from that same account, we pay for the fuel oil number 6, right? It's the same one. Diesel number 2. Diesel number 2, right. And then is the interpreter. Oh. There's the interpreter. Apologies, just a technical glitch. We'll be back on in a second. And what we're doing then is warning that in any determination, it might place the authority in a more precarious situation. Engineer, thank you for what you've expressed. However, I'm not going to go completely into the details because I do have other questions further down. However, those 100 million that you're talking about is exactly what is being requested to reconcile. So we're talking about $105.5 million in additional expenses of fuel, in addition to what had been invoiced and projected based on factors that had been done in a projection of costs of fuel, which is not what happened. I mean, one of the big points that we're bringing is 105 million in purchase of fuel, negative 8 million. I mean, we're talking about almost $97 million injected that were requested to inject it to the authority related to that purchase of fuel and purchase of energy during December, January, and February. That's the nature of the reconciliation. And it's not so much that there was a lowering or a massive exodus of funds from the part of the authority. It's just that the authority incurred in additional expenses of fuel that had not been forecasted. And that's part of the reason why we are here. So in that sense, that concern of that reduction of the 100 million that from the box or from purses corresponds to part of the reconciliation. So it's part of the discussion that we are having. Secondly, regarding future projections of fuel in the past reconciliation, there was a projection of close to $80, $85 per barrel. And now there's a projection of close to, there's a projection between 100 and over $130 regarding bunker, $140 related to diesel. So in that sense, there is a request as well of sufficient funds so as to cover that projection of a raise that has been had. And if we've also seen worldwide, specifically with petroleum, even though there was a rise, substantial rise in the past months, the markets are stabilizing and are starting to pull back, not at the same level that it had risen, but that is more or less a trend. So all of this that you have talked about comes out of this reconciliation that we're doing. And I understand the concern regarding the 100 million from the part of the authority that is mentioned from the authority. However, as I said, I'm not cataloging it this way, but there's a constancy between these two amounts. So what we're trying to understand for now is that cash flow from the part of the authority and how much really is the effect that it's had in that flow from the authority. That's what we're trying to do now. So thank you. That's a direction. Mr. Commissioner, I'd like to add to what you've mentioned of the markets, just to illustrate to the commission, and I know that you also have data from other sources, but the, how should I say, the course that the markets continue to take, in spite of the fact that there was a peak, and then after there has been a decrease, unfortunately for all of us, again, it has taken a turn for an increase. Just to give you an example, just yesterday, the barrel of diesel was at 148, what we use, and now overnight it's in $172. In the case of residual number 6, yesterday was in 126, and today it's in 132. So it has again risen, if you will, with the availability of these fuels. And so all this type of uncertainty of overnight taking leaps, unexpected leaps, which is not the normal behavior of markets, even though last year consistently fuel did rise throughout the entire year, as we saw, but not in the magnitude or at the speed as has occurred since the conflict began between Russia and Ukraine. Thank you for the information, engineer. And this, we'll see this further on in that Annex C that was sent by the authority with the motion of March 18th, where we have the projections of fuel. That's why the projections of fuel are done long term. You can't just take a few specific days in the month to project it into the future. I mean, several of the questions that are had for the authority regarding Annex C are going to be regarding that projection, how it was done, and where the data came from. So the Bureau, as I said, works with the information that is presented to it, with the information that is brought and filed, and well, these are projections that we're also going to see later on in today's hearing. So, well, going back, Mr. Morales, I need to understand the dynamic within the Electric Power Authority. You said that you have accounts where suppliers are paid. The Electric Power Authority has invoicing throughout the month, and throughout the month, they also receive payments generally corresponding to the previous month, correct? Correct. Right. So then, taken out from what could happen, the authority, for all intents and purposes, in their cash flow, they recover the costs of a given month in the following month, and that goes into the authority's accounts. How does the authority do its distribution of those funds that come in through invoicing or payments from the part of the consumers? Specifically, well, answer that one first, and then I'll give you a follow-up. Yes, it's all done based on projections of cash flow, which you know how much we are billing weekly through the period of the 13 weeks. And in like manner, we go into the operational areas of LUMA and of the authority of when income is expected, be it with, or actually payable is expected, whether it's payroll or contractors, and it's done, a projection is done then through 13 weeks. So according to what you're telling me then, and I understand the area projection, but what it's done is that everything is received into the authority's account, and from there it is distributed to all the different accounts that are used to pay suppliers. Correct. All right, so for all intents and purposes, and for the purposes of this discussion, the reserve, or the reserve margin, if you will, actually, what would you call that amount? That would be the authority's working capital. Working capital. All right. Well, let's work with it as working capital. So that working capital of the authority that is at now 331.5 million was on December 17, 472.7 million. It's for all of the operations of the authority. Could it be interpreted as could it be interpreted as working capital of the authority for all of its accounts and all of its suppliers, including fuel? Correct. Apologies, I didn't hear. Yes, correct. Correct. All right, good then. At the levels of March 11th, the 30 million that we're going to see later on, but the 30 million to which Attorney Bolaños alluded to earlier, if we take that balance of March 11th, it would represent about 10% of that working capital that the authority has. Correct. 30 million out of 331, approximately 10%. And again, it's, just rounding off, it's Monday morning, but what is a typical account or the typical biggest payment that the authority might do in any given month? Oh, doubtless fuel. Fuel, all right. So then, in the past quarter, the authority has been receiving between 180 and 190 million dollars per month as far as billing and receipts. Does that amount make sense regarding what has been seen in the past quarter? I would say that it could be a little bit more Okay, a little bit more, a little bit less. It might fluctuate, but that's a range. I would say that it's more than $200 million per month. Okay, then. At what time? At what time, say in the past year, as the chairman has very well asked, at what time in the past year was the authority in crisis, not having working capital? I don't know. Maybe you could clear up the question. The authority basically argues that the Energy Bureau should not defer additional costs regarding the purchase of fuel because it could affect its cash flow. But the effects in cash flow is not the same as going into operational crisis. So the question is, has the authority experienced any type of operational crisis in the past year based on a lack of working capital? Respectfully, Commissioner, if you could define what you mean by crisis. I want to highlight that the Electric Power Authority is under Title III since July 2nd of 2017. Yes, a bankruptcy process. Therefore, there's reports not just operational but finance-wise that monitor the financial health of the authority, operationally and financially. Yes. Okay. All right. I'm going to qualify my question then. Instead of crisis, I'm going to say rephrase. If you could just mute while I question, because I think there's an echo. I'm just going to specify my question. In the past year, at what time or times has the authority been unable to pay any of their suppliers? I'm not talking about the debt in Title III. I'm sorry, that is under the process of bankruptcy, but the authority continues to operate with what it can continue to operate with. In the past year, at what time or times have payments not been able to been done to suppliers for want of working capital, specifically regarding fuel? Here we've managed to pay all suppliers and contractors according to our terms, to the contracts that we have with them. I think that where we faced the most issues was immediately after Hurricane Maria and also after the declaration of emergency because of the pandemic, where we saw a reduction in billing. Yes, but these were extraordinary circumstances. In spite of that, we are still suffering the effects of the pandemic. It would seem as though the authorities' operations have stabilized within what I call the new normal, which is the situation of our still emerging out of the pandemic. Correct? I want to highlight that the authority is in bankruptcy process, and we are monitoring the financial health constantly, particularly weekly, with the reports that are produced and published for the interest of stakeholders. All right, could the authority provide before Friday reports of cash flow, especially with working capital, maybe of the past year? Yes. Thank you. All right. The authority speaks of risk that there is regarding being left without cash flow if the Energy Bureau were to determine to defer additional amounts. Could you quantify or qualify that risk? What are we talking about? And to what levels are we talking about? Well, obviously the risks of continuing to provide services, essential services to the people of Puerto Rico, particularly with, or making sure that we need to pay suppliers of fuel. All right, in the past year, how many times have fuel suppliers not been paid for want of cash? 0. So all billings of fuel have been paid for punctually to suppliers. In general terms, yes, they've been paid. Discussions, in general terms, we have always paid. Of course, 1,000 barrels, 1,002 barrels, and price, that I understand those discussions, but in general terms, in the past year, there has been a lack of payment for want of cash to fuel suppliers. Apologies, could you repeat your question? It's basically just a repetition of the same question. I'm going to eliminate it. You've already answered. There's been no lack of payment, because that's exactly what we're doing here. It's what we've done in the past year regarding the reconciliations of the factors of purchase of fuel, especially the most volatile one, and purchase of energy. The purpose is, sure enough, to give the authority the funds needed for their operation, but that determination needs to be framed in what the law requires as being just and reasonable. And so the reasonableness, according to certain amounts, that the authority should exercise its powers and its contractual obligations in order for the gas suppliers to pay for, because of the reasonableness of recovering that from customers is what needs to be analyzed. So I understand that the authority stance has been, or is, based on motion of March 18th, to recover it from customers, and maybe at some point, if the authority covers some of its contractors of natural gas, then it would be passed on to the consumer at some point in the future. So the other side of that coin is, why does a consumer have to pay for something that should be paid for by providers of natural gas in the absence of providing said services? So that's where the Energy Bureau needs to find its balance. In fact, in the resolution that was done in past December 30th, the Energy Bureau requested to the authority providing of detailed information regarding the situation that was happening in San Juan. And the only thing that the authority said, and I don't want to paraphrase, the only thing that the authority expressed is that it was in negotiation with its gas supplier in the San Juan area. So the question that comes up regarding that word negotiations is, could the authority qualify what they call negotiations, seeing as to how this is just enforcing a penal clause of a contract from the authority to which it has a right? Could the authority qualify what it calls negotiations? Josue Colon with Electric Energy. Mr. Commissioner, I would like to clear up before Nelson continues and before the rest of the components of the Electric Power Authority continue answering your questions, that the authority has at no time intended or that customers not be returned the amounts that we recover of the claims that we have to fuel suppliers. What the authority is presenting and alerting to the Bureau is that until we do not conclude these conversations or claims that we have with both suppliers, we cannot speculate on projections because contracts and clauses that are in contracts are not specific. Look, if there's this difference, this is what you owe me. It's part of a negotiation and the conversation that is being had between the authority and suppliers in order to agree then with the amount of money that we understand needs to be returned to us. And since we are not at that point yet, or we hope to be soon, from there then in the past requests that the Bureau has done, we have not felt at the Electric Power Authority like we're ready to present estimates that might be inaccurate and that might lead then the Bureau to err or be mistaken in presumptions in the future. And again, we reaffirm our internal determination that we will provide accurate and correct information to the Bureau as soon as we have it available. And we hope that this might be within the next weeks. Engineer, thank you for the information. That eso ayuda. The clauses of the Naturgy contract and New Fortress, they are clear regarding the formula that will be implemented to calculate, or what will be implemented for the calculation of the penalty. They are clear. What I think that you are talking to me about is circumstances that gave way to the use of diesel. Could you clear up whether that's what you're referring to regarding negotiations and conversations? Because the costs that we have incurred that are not necessarily, it's not necessarily a difference between one cost of a determined barrel as opposed to the cost of natural gas. I mean, we, in our changing the use of fuel, our units also incur in other series of operations that would otherwise not be necessary if we were in natural gas. So likewise, the units are exposed. When being exposed to these fuels, there is a reduction of the hours when they are combustion turbines to be in service. Also, the thermal units, the boilers, are also subject to additional costs like cleanings and other work that we need to do. But going back, we are in those conversations with both suppliers. In the meeting, we have the chief of the Office of Fuel. He could add to the conversation that we're having at this time. It's not as simple as the contract specifies what the difference is, because just by way of example, in the case of Naturgy right now, because of differences that there are in the factors that need to be used for the cost of number 6 petroleum and diesel, what there is in the contract, well, the claim that we're doing will first be based on costs, and then once some conditions of the contract are updated, it will be subject to other conditions. So there are several situations where we are still in conversation. In the case of in the case of New Fortress, the conversation also revolves around the specific days in which, because of New Fortress, the gas was not available, as opposed to some work that was done at the terminal with the fuel lines that should have been done years ago, and they hadn't been done. And they are being done at this time. This led to, so they've been doing it for several weeks or months. And so this conversation is part of the negotiation. So it's not as simple as just going to an Excel spreadsheet and then putting it in numbers. Unfortunately, engineer, we must defer. The clauses are very clear in the contract. There they establish it's under obligation for parties. I understand that the attorneys at the authority might basically shed more light upon it, but I understand we're talking about other circumstances specifically, but we are talking here about the cost of fuel, the maintenance and the additional expenses that the authority might incur. That's already outside of the frame that we're working on with this reconciliation. And yes, it is very simple on a spreadsheet of Excel. Basically, the penal costs in general terms just say that the difference with a difference or with a penalty will be this. It basically establishes clearly how it's calculated. On the basis of that, the Energy Bureau is, because it's purely fuel. The other things that you're mentioning, maybe it would be peripheral. I understand that they could be part of that conversation. Now, call them conversations because the Bureau in dispositions of the penal cause are a little bit challenging, but however, what we are pondering, what we're looking at is, according to what I'm understanding, is that specifically regarding fuel, there are differences here from New Fortress and the authority. There's a difference between what days they're going to apply, what hours are going to apply, and what costs are going to apply. And so that could go into conversations, and we understand this. However, the Bureau needs to grant a determination within its capabilities regarding the information that is in the file. If the authority understands that the estimates that the Bureau has requested do not correspond to what the authority believes could be recovered, then it is the duty of the authority to put the Bureau in a position to grant a determination, providing the estimates that the authority believes are the ones that should proceed. If you would both allow, and forgive me for interrupting, without going into the legal analysis that Rivera has mentioned as to whether it is a penal clause or not, I see the following. If it is, it's simple. It limits itself to what the disposition says, because legally you can't claim anything else. But say it wasn't a penalty, well, even more could be claimed. So the credit to consumer would be higher. So we could lay out as basis, unless the authority put us in a position of elevating that credit that could be given to the consumer. But offhand, we need the literal application. Understand that it is a penal clause. Thank you. What the chairman has just mentioned from the Bureau is correct. We expect, that's why it's not just a clause as it is in the contract. Our expectation is that we might be able to claim more, as he stated, and opportunity to be able to return it to customers. But going back, we are alerting the Bureau that once we have a certainty with these amounts, and when I say certainty, I mean that we be reasonably confident that it's the amount that we are going to receive back from both suppliers, then we will be in a disposition of being able to share all of the information accurately with the Bureau so that the Bureau can perform its responsibility. But in no way are we going to submit information based on projections that we are not confident as being accurate yet, in order to induce the Bureau into proceeding or deferring costs that the authority might not be able to recover later and then operate against our cash flow. Okay, just to explain a little bit regarding how the Bureau defers, engineer. Just to give an example, in the case of earthquakes, the total was around $300 million of deferment. X amount has been recovered from the insurer and from FEMA. The Bureau, once all of everything that is recovered is had from part of the insurer and from FEMA, as the Bureau ordered to the authority to report, then a final reconciliation will be done. It's the same type of thing that is done with this type of deferment. At the end of the day, if it turned out to be more in the saving, well, then it's passed on to the customer. If it was less, well, then it'd have to be recovered in the same way that it works in the clause. Here, I think that what's in controversy, let me rephrase, what the authority is worried about is that it'd be deferred now because it could affect their cash flow. But what the authority is saying is, let's do this in the future but we'll recover the money today, and then in the future we'll do whatever will be done. I understand that this is the request and the concern of the authority, all of it cemented on a cash flow that could affect its operation. I think that in general terms, it's what the authority is telling us. And so the Bureau will take this into account, finding a balance of interests in terms of what would be just and reasonable for the authority and for the consumer. Right. So, correct. Mr. Commissioner, we concur in what you've just said, and just adding, just to round off the statement that you've just made, is that we are greatly worried by what has happened. You've mentioned the 300 million that were deferred, and to date, since the date where it had been deferred, those amounts, the authority has yet to recover them. As long as that occurs, the authority is operating, if you will, financing those amounts that we have not recovered over time. I mean, imagine, since the earthquakes, since December of 2019, January 2020, and we're in March of 2022, and we have yet to recover in the total everything that was deferred at a given time. First of all, we need to clarify that it was the authority itself that suggested to defer those amounts regarding the earthquakes, and in the sense of recovering them, it could be an incentive for the authority to do all necessary and reasonable effort to recover these amounts that were already assigned. Apparently, Cortez is the amount that could help the authority to recover those funds. In other words, it could work as an incentive for the authority in order to continue with their efforts of recovery. So we understand the matter of cash flow, Mr. Morales. To round off our conversation, or for all intents and purposes, $331.5 million that you alluded to is the working capital for the authority's operations, including its purchase of fuel, with the cash flow that we were talking about, of entry and egress, with the billing from the customers and the payment to the authority suppliers, correct? Yes, correct. I'd like to mention that for the payment of fuel supply, the payments are done from the T&D service accounts. I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part? The payments to fuel suppliers are done from the T&D service accounts. But yes, it all comes out of distribution, as we mentioned earlier. Go ahead. Are you saying that the accounts are part of the working capital of the 770 million in the operational accounts of LUMA? No, let me rephrase. Let me rephrase. For T&D, what I mentioned was that the payments to suppliers are done through the T&D service accounts, which have $770.6 million in their working capital account. At this moment, the funds are there, and then as the specific account goes down over the fuel service accounts, well, then it's recovered. 330 million. Okay, all right, engineer. This part is very important. It's very important. Fuel is an expensive generation, isn't it? Correct. And how is it that the payments of fuel go through the operational accounts of transmission and distribution? They are not operational accounts. They are T&D service accounts. Well, then let me rephrase. Could you then define what the T&D service accounts are? Well, it's the same service. It's where payments are done. Specifically, if it's having to do with purchase of fuel, the payments are done from those accounts, according to the operations management agreement. If it's from purchase power, it's done from another account, according to the operations management agreement. Ms. Umblum, I think. ¿Qué es lo que usted quería comentar ahora? No, no quería intervenir, pero solo para un poco de claridad, los ingresos llegan a través de las cuentas que hemos estado hablando con los 300 millones de dólares incluidos, y entonces sí se transfieren a las cuentas de transmisión y distribución para compra de combustible y energía. Hay algunas causas específicas. Puede que se cambie un PPA entre Genco y Rico, así que es así como se habían contemplado. Y entonces esas se pagan en esas cuentas de transmisión y distribución. Así que el dinero llega a las cuentas de reserva que estamos hablando, que creo que había más de 313 a partir de marzo, 11 de marzo. Disculpas. Todavía el lunes en la mañana, sí lo sé. Y luego se transfieren a cuentas específicas de transmisión y distribución. Algunas son compra de combustible y las facturas se pagan de esas cuentas. ¿Quién maneja esto? LUMA lo hace. Así que en LUMA hay aprobaciones requeridas por parte de la Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica, y LUMA en el equipo de tesorería son los que llevan a cabo la transferencia como tal. Bien, para todos propósitos entonces es LUMA quien está manejando los pagos de combustible. Desde sus cuentas, déjenme reiterar, desde las cuentas de servicio de transmisión y distribución. La pregunta es entonces, ¿qué capital de trabajo está afectado por cualquier referido o deferido adicional del negociado? Todos. Perdón, no se escuchó bien. Good afternoon, Enya Castro. The truth is that the bank accounts are maintained by LUMA as an operator. We have accounts. We have the service accounts, and we have the operating accounts. By the operating account, as LUMA representative have spoken, is where all the customer collection comes in through. Then, through the service accounts, as Mr. Morales said, they're identified. That is where then reserves are distributed, or balances that need to be had there, and then the payments are done. In most of these accounts, we need to have, 4 months of reserves to comply with our obligations. Out of these accounts handled by LUMA that we need to approve, and we need to replenish them, we currently, with one we paid for fuel, with the other it's for purchase energy. There's another that is called contingency, and there's another which is for outages. So that would just be a clarification for our Honorable Commissioner. Thank you, Ms. Castro. So this helps a lot to the conversation, because we're not talking then about affecting a working capital or of 331 million. According to what you're describing, the working capital of the unified system would be $1,092 million. And seeing as to how the accounts where the payments come from the T&D service account, if I may clear up, of course, Mr. Commissioner, the service accounts are accounts established according to the Operating and Management Agreement, which requires some additional reserves. The working capital as such comes from the authority's accounts of $331 million. The $331 million. If, as I mentioned earlier, regularly, as payments are done for the T&D service accounts, it's recovered out of the authority's accounts. According to the T&D Operations and Management Agreement. So I'd just like to highlight that we don't want, just respectfully, we don't want to violate the requirements of the T&D Operations and Management account. The $760 million there can be used as something that can be used without restriction. No, I understand. All right. Thank you very much for the clarification. If you would allow, Morales, it's not a matter of the authority wanting to violate an agreement or not. It's just that in the case that this termination were done, the Energy Bureau would have a resolution order, and you know that as when regulated, you need to comply. That just needs to be clear. All right, having cleared up the situation, I have no further questions along this line of questioning. Mr. Morales, is there anything that you'd like to add to the discussion before we move on to the next point? No, thank you. Finances would be providing the information that was requested by the Bureau. Thank you. Before continuing on, attorney, apologies. The cash flow that you have is of the authority in general, including T&D accounts? Or just 331.5? Of the T&D accounts, it reflects. Good. Then we need that. Well, just to clear up, the requests regarding the last year of cash flow has to be from both types of accounts. Correct. All right, good. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Rivera. Torres, before you go in, and in the case that the authority doesn't have the information, the petition of Commissioner Rivera extends to LUMA and work on it together in such a way that the petition of Commissioner Rivera is complied with. Attorney? Yes. We've been going almost 2 hours. It'd be good to take a break. I don't know if you'd like to take a lunch break, but have it be 45 minutes? If you agree. We'd be getting back at 1:15. Go ahead, Engineer Colon. Yes, on the part of the authority, we agree with what you've just suggested. All right, 1:15. 1:15, thank you. Thank you.